The air inside the cave is thick with smoke and the metallic taste of fear. Corporal James Mitchell crouches in the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, February 1945. His hands trembling as he adjusts the fuel tanks strapped to his back. 40 pounds of jellied gasoline. One spark, one bullet finding the wrong target, and he becomes a human torch. 20 yards ahead, a concrete pillbox bristles with machine gun fire, cutting down Marines who've already tried twice to take it with grenades and satchel charges. The bodies are still warm in the black sand. Mitchell's squad leader looks at him, nods once. There's no other way. Mitchell rises, thumb on the ignition trigger of his M2 flamethrower, and begins walking toward the position that's already killed 11 men this morning. What happens in the next 30 seconds will either save his platoon or guarantee his name gets carved into a memorial back home. The weapon in his hands represents something new in modern warfare, something that changes not just tactics, but the very psychology of battle itself. If you want to understand the brutal reality of the Pacific War and the weapons that decided its outcome, make sure you're subscribed. We're bringing you the documented truth, not Hollywood fiction. It's early 1944, and the United States Marine Corps faces a strategic nightmare across the Pacific theater. Island after island, from Tarawa to Saipan, American forces encountered the same lethal problem. Japanese defenders, following a doctrine refined through years of warfare in China and Manchuria, have transformed islands into fortified zones of death. These aren't simple trenches. They're elaborate networks of reinforced concrete bunkers, interconnected tunnels carved into coral and volcanic rock, spider holes, camouflaged so perfectly that Marines walk past them before machine gun fire erupts from behind. On Tarawa alone in November 1943, over 1,000 Marines died in 76 hours trying to dislodge fewer than 5,000 Japanese defenders from an island 2 miles long. The mathematics of this kind of warfare are unsustainable. At this rate, an invasion of the Japanese home islands could cost 1 million American casualties. Something has to change. The strategic context is brutal in its simplicity. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States commits to an island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, aiming to establish airfields close enough to bomb the Japanese mainland. Each island brings American forces closer to Tokyo, but each island is also more heavily fortified than the last. By early 1944, Japan has pulled back its defensive perimeter, concentrating forces on islands deemed critical, pouring resources into making them into killing grounds. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu, these names will be written in blood. The Japanese command structure, led by officers like General Tadamichi Kirubayashi on Iwo Jima, studies American assault tactics meticulously and designed defenses specifically to counter them. They know the Marines will come with artillery, with air support, with naval bombardment that can last days. So they dig deeper, they build thicker, they wait. Understanding the Japanese defensive mindset requires looking at their military culture honestly, without caricature. Bushido, the warrior code that emphasizes honor and death before surrender, is real and deeply embedded in the Imperial Japanese Army. But it's more than cultural tradition. It's systematic indoctrination. Soldiers are taught that capture means shame not just for themselves, but for their families back home. Training includes conditioning that frames surrender as unthinkable. Officers routinely tell troops that Americans torture and execute prisoners, which makes fighting to the death seem like the only rational choice. This isn't just fanaticism, though Western propaganda often frames it that way. It's a calculated military doctrine designed to maximize the cost of every inch of territory. On Saipan in June 1944, Japanese soldiers and civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender, convinced by their own leadership that capture means horror. American forces, expecting some level of surrender as they'd seen in European theaters, are psychologically unprepared for an enemy that will turn every cave, every bunker, every spider hole into a potential tomb for attackers. The result is a war of attrition, where conventional assault tactics become exponentially deadly. The terrain itself becomes a weapon in Japanese hands. Pacific Islands aren't flat beaches and palm trees. They're nightmares of volcanic rock, coral ridges sharp enough to slice through boots, dense jungle where visibility drops to yards, and underground labyrinths where sound and direction become disorienting. On Peleliu, September 1944, Marines assault what intelligence reports describe as a simple airfield operation expected to take 4 days. Instead, they encounter the Uma Brogel, a coral ridge system the Marines call Bloody Nose Ridge, where Japanese forces have created a 3-dimensional battlefield. Defenders occupy caves on multiple levels, with firing positions that cover each other. Destroy one position, and fire immediately comes from 2 others you couldn't see. The temperature exceeds 100 degrees. Men die from heat stroke while carrying wounded under fire. The battle takes 2 months and costs over 10,000 American casualties. Traditional tactics, frontal assaults supported by artillery, fail repeatedly because Japanese positions are either too deep to destroy or too interconnected to isolate. Grenades bounce off concrete. Rifle fire can't penetrate reinforced positions. Even satchel charges, bags of explosives thrown or placed by engineers, often fail to collapse entrances. Marines start calling it the Impossible Island. But Peleliu isn't unique. It's a preview of what's coming. The problem crystallizes in after-action reports from throughout 1943 and early 1944. Battalion commanders describe the same scenario repeatedly. A bunker or cave is located, artillery is called in, pounding the position. When the barrage lifts, infantry advances, believing the position is neutralized. Then, from the smoke and dust, machine gun fire erupts. The Japanese defenders, protected in deep positions with multiple feet of reinforced concrete or solid rock above them, simply waited out the barrage. Marines caught in the open are cut down. Even when engineers manage to get close enough to throw satchel charges, the explosions often only collapse the entrance, and within hours, sometimes minutes, Japanese troops dig themselves out or emerge from alternate exits. The psychological toll is devastating. Men watch their friends die taking the same position 3-4 times. Exhaustion sets in. Combat fatigue, what we'd later call PTSD, becomes epidemic. Officers recognize that sending men forward with rifles and grenades into these positions is effectively ordering them to die. The casualty rates among infantry units in the Pacific become statistically worse than almost any other theater of World War II. Something new is needed, something that can reach into those fortified positions and neutralize defenders in a way that conventional weapons cannot. The M2 flamethrower isn't actually new in concept. Flamethrowers were used in World War I, primitive devices that were as dangerous to operators as to enemies. But the M2, refined and fielded by the Marine Corps starting in 1943, represents a technological evolution that makes it practical, or at least as practical as carrying 70 pounds of flaming fuel into combat can ever be. The Chemical Warfare Service, working with frontline feedback from Marine units, develops a weapon system that uses a mixture called napalm, a jellied gasoline that sticks to surfaces and burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The M2 consists of 3 tanks worn on the operator's back, 2 containing fuel mixture and 1 with compressed nitrogen that provides propulsion. A handheld wand with an ignition system allows the operator to fire a stream of flaming gel that can reach 30 to 40 yards under ideal conditions. In practice, effective range is closer to 20 yards, which means flamethrower operators have to get suicidally close to their targets. The weapon weighs 70 pounds fully loaded, making the operator slow and vulnerable. If a bullet pierces the tanks, the operator can be immolated. Every man who carries an M2 into combat knows he's a priority target. Japanese defenders quickly learn to identify flamethrower operators by their distinctive silhouette and focus fire accordingly. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in sustained combat is measured in minutes, not hours.
But the weapon solves problems nothing else can. Napalm doesn't just burn, it consumes oxygen. In the confined space of a bunker or cave, a flamethrower burst can suffocate defenders, even if the flames don't reach them directly. The jellied fuel flows into crevices, around corners, into spaces that grenades can't penetrate. Most critically, it terrorizes. The sound of a flamethrower igniting, a distinctive roar, becomes psychologically devastating to Japanese defenders. Historical records, including post-war interviews with Japanese survivors, describe the flamethrower as the most feared weapon in the American arsenal. More than artillery, more than airstrikes. The reason is simple and horrific. Being burned alive is every human being's primal nightmare. The defensive doctrine of fighting to the death assumes a certain kind of death by bullet or shrapnel, quick if not painless. Fire offers neither. It's agony, prolonged and inescapable. Even the most disciplined soldiers' resolve breaks when that stream of flame enters their position. Suddenly, surrender becomes thinkable. More often, defenders simply die where they stand, unable or unwilling to flee into American fire. Training flamethrower operators requires creating men willing to walk into hell. Marine divisions assign the M2 to specially trained teams, usually working in squads of 4 to 6. Standard doctrine puts 2 riflemen protecting each flamethrower operator, covering his approach and watching for counterfire. In training camps across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Hawaii, Marine instructors drill recruits on approach tactics, teaching them to use terrain, to move in short bursts, to time their advances between enemy firing cycles. They learn to crawl through mud and coral with 70 pounds on their backs. They practice emergency tank jettison procedures for when, not if, they take fire. Instructors are blunt about mortality rates. Many volunteers don't survive their first combat deployment. Why do men volunteer? Some are ordered. Others volunteer out of unit loyalty, knowing their friends will die if someone doesn't neutralize those bunkers. Some, honestly, are young and invincible in their own minds, unable to fully process the risk. Training emphasizes that flamethrower operations aren't about heroism. They're about solving a tactical problem. You eliminate the position so your unit can advance. Whether you survive is secondary to mission completion. It's a cold calculus, but necessary in the brutal arithmetic of Pacific Island warfare. January 1945. The American High Command finalizes plans for Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima, a volcanic island halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland. Intelligence estimates Japanese strength at roughly 13,000 defenders, under the command of General Kuribayashi, one of Japan's most capable and innovative commanders. Kuribayashi studies American doctrine and makes a revolutionary decision. No banzai charges, no suicidal attacks. Instead, pure defense in depth. He orders the construction of 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions. Bunkers are reinforced with steel and concrete salvaged from the island's peacetime infrastructure. Firing ports are designed to be nearly invisible from American assault approaches. Artillery is sighted to cover beaches with interlocking fire. Kuribayashi knows he cannot win. His goal is to kill so many Americans that the cost of future invasions, particularly of the Japanese home islands, becomes politically unbearable. He tells his men they are not expected to survive. They are expected to kill 10 Americans each before dying. If they achieve this, Japan might negotiate a peace instead of facing total annihilation. It's desperation disguised as strategy, but it's effective desperation. February 19, 1945. American Haya Nagashi with interlocking fire. Kuribayashi knows he cannot win. Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. The landing itself is deceptively easy. Minimal fire as thousands of Marines wade ashore, establishing beachheads according to plan. Then, precisely as Kuribayashi calculated, when the beaches are crowded with men and equipment, Japanese artillery opens fire. Mortars, rockets, and carefully sighted guns turn the black volcanic sand into a killing ground. Within hours, hundreds of Marines are dead or wounded. The advance inland grinds to a crawl. Every yard is contested. Japanese positions invisible until they open fire, pin down entire companies. The volcanic sand makes digging in nearly impossible. Vehicles bog down. Wounded men sink into the loose earth under the weight of their gear. By nightfall of the first day, casualties exceed 2,500, and the worst terrain, the Central Highlands and Mount Suribachi, hasn't even been reached. Marine commanders realize immediately that Iwo Jima will be worse than Tarawa, worse than Saipan, potentially worse than anything they've faced. Flamethrower teams are given priority deployment orders. This battle will be won or lost in the caves. The assault on Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano dominating Iwo Jima's southern tip, begins on February 21st. Suribachi isn't just a mountain, it's a fortress, honeycombed with tunnels and positions that have survived days of naval bombardment. Marines advance up the slopes under continuous fire from positions they can't see, can't locate, can't suppress with conventional weapons. Casualties mount. On February 23rd, a patrol reaches the summit and raises a small American flag. The famous photograph, the second flag raising later that day, becomes one of the most iconic images of World War II. But the photograph doesn't show what happens in the days before and after. It doesn't show the flamethrower teams systematically working their way up Suribachi's slopes, cave by cave, burning out defenders who refuse to surrender. Private First Class Donald Rule, a flamethrower operator, dies on the second day of fighting when he throws himself on a grenade to save his squad mates. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation doesn't mention the flamethrower, focusing instead on the sacrifice. But his weapon, left behind when he fell, is picked up by another Marine and continues its work. This is the pattern throughout Iwo Jima. Flamethrower operators die at catastrophic rates, but the weapon's effectiveness ensures someone always picks it up and continues the mission. The systematic reduction of Japanese defenses across Iwo Jima becomes a test of endurance and will. Marine infantry, supported by Sherman tanks retrofitted with flamethrower systems, advance yard by yard. Standard doctrine evolves in real time. Engineers use explosives to seal cave entrances after flamethrower teams clear them, preventing reoccupation. In the central sector, where rocky terrain makes tank support impossible, flamethrower teams work independently, stalking Japanese positions with an intimacy that turns combat into something medieval in its brutality. Sergeant Herbert Schreier, who leads the first flag-raising patrol, later describes watching a flamethrower team clear a bunker complex. The operators approach slowly, covered by rifle fire, then unleash bursts of flame into firing ports. The sound that emerges, he says, is inhuman. Something between screaming and the roar of the fire itself. Some Japanese defenders bolt from alternate exits, only to be shot down. Others remain inside, choosing fire over capture. Schreier admits that even Marines who witness this regularly never get used to it. It's war reduced to its most elemental, most terrible form, but it works. Positions that withstood days of artillery bombardment fall in minutes to flamethrower assault. The cost, always, is measured in the lives of the men carrying those 70-pound weapons into point-blank range.
The northern plateau of Iwo Jima, dominated by Hill 382, Nishi Ridge, and the Turkey Knob, becomes the site of the battle's most intense fighting. Here, Kuribayashi concentrates his strongest defenses, knowing that when these positions fall, the island falls. For nearly 3 weeks, from late February through mid-March, Marine units assault these positions repeatedly. Each assault follows the same pattern. Artillery preparation, infantry advance, Japanese positions open fire, infantry is pinned down, flamethrower teams maneuver forward. The cycle repeats, position by position, day after day. Corporal Herschel Williams, a flamethrower operator with the 21st Marines, spends 4 hours on February 23rd clearing a complex of pillboxes and bunkers that have stopped his battalion's advance. Williams, covered by 4 riflemen, approaches each position individually, burning out defenders, then moving to the next. He's exposed to enemy fire continuously. All 4 of his covering riflemen are killed or wounded during the operation. Williams somehow survives. His Medal of Honor citation details 7 separate positions neutralized, but it doesn't capture the physical and psychological toll. In post-war interviews, Williams describes the weight of the flamethrower, the heat, the exhaustion, the faces of Japanese soldiers visible through flames. He describes nightmares that last decades. By March 26, 1945, Iwo Jima is declared secure. The actual fighting continues for several more days, with isolated Japanese holdouts continuing to resist. The final toll? Nearly 7,000 Americans killed, over 19,000 wounded. Japanese casualties exceed 20,000, with only a handful of prisoners taken. General Kuribayashi is never found, his body presumably lost in the island's cave systems. For the Marines who fought there, Iwo Jima represents the pinnacle and nadir of the Pacific War. The capture of the island provides emergency landing sites for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan, arguably saving thousands of airmen's lives and justifying the operation strategically. But the cost in blood is staggering. And central to that cost, both inflicted and paid, is the M2 flamethrower. After-action reports from Marine divisions credit flamethrowers with neutralizing positions that could not have been taken any other way. Casualty figures show that flamethrower-equipped units suffer higher immediate casualty, but achieve objectives faster, ultimately reducing total casualties by preventing prolonged stalemates. It's a grim equation, trading the lives of flamethrower operators for time and reduced exposure for the rest of their units. The legacy of the M2 flamethrower in the Pacific extends beyond Iwo Jima. On Okinawa, April through June 1945, the weapon proves equally critical against Japanese cave defenses in the island's southern highland. The Battle of Okinawa becomes the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, with over 12,000 American deaths and estimates of Japanese military casualties exceeding 100,000. Flamethrower tactics refined through bitter experience on previous islands become standard doctrine. Every Marine rifle company has at least one flamethrower team.
Tank-mounted flamethrowers, the M4 Sherman Zippo tanks, provide mobile fire support that can reach positions infantry flamethrowers cannot. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders remains devastating. Post-war studies, including interviews with Japanese soldiers who did surrender, consistently identify the flamethrower as the weapon they feared most, more than any bomber or artillery piece. The reason isn't mysterious. It's primal. Fire represents death in its most horrifying form, and the jellied napalm of the M2 offers no escape, no quick end, only agony. For American planners contemplating Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands, flamethrowers are slated for massive deployment. Casualty estimates for Downfall run into the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, including Japanese civilians. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 make those plans moot, ending the war before they're implemented. It's worth noting that those bombings, horrific as they are, kill through fire as much as through blast and radiation. Tokyo's firebombing in March 1945 kills more people in a single night than either atomic bomb. The flamethrower's tactical role and the strategic role of incendiary warfare exist on a continuum of brutality that defines the Pacific War's final year. Military doctrine absorbs the lessons of flamethrower warfare quickly. The United States Army and Marine Corps retain flamethrowers in their arsenals through the Korean War and into Vietnam, though technological evolution produces lighter models and eventually man-portable systems that are less cumbersome. The Soviet Union, studying American tactics, develops their own flamethrower doctrine, deploying them extensively in urban warfare during World War II's final months. Post-war military academies worldwide include flamethrower tactics in training curricula for combat engineers and assault troops. The weapon's effectiveness in confined spaces and against fortified positions remains unmatched for decades, until precision-guided munitions and thermobaric weapons provide alternatives. The psychological dimension, the terror factor, becomes a subject of study in military psychology. How do you train soldiers to face a weapon that activates every survival instinct to flee? The Japanese experience on islands across the Pacific provides case studies in military education programs globally. The consensus is blunt. No amount of training or indoctrination can fully prepare troops for the psychological impact of flamethrower assault. Courage has limits. Fire exceeds them. But beyond tactics and doctrine, beyond strategic analysis, there's the human cost that can't be quantified in after-action reports. The men who carried M2 flamethrowers into combat on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and a dozen other Pacific islands didn't come home unchanged. Many didn't come home at all. Those who survived carry memories that don't fade. Herschel Williams, who lived until 2022, spent 70 years after the war speaking about his experiences. And in every interview, the weight is visible. Not just the physical weight of the weapon, but the moral weight of what he did with it. The faces behind the flames, the sounds that can't be unheard. This is true for thousands of Pacific War veterans who never received medals, whose names aren't remembered, who simply did what they were ordered to do in circumstances where every option was terrible. The Japanese soldiers who faced those flames, who died in caves and bunkers across the Pacific, they were human too. Indoctrinated? Yes. Fighting for a cause that history judges harshly? Absolutely. But human. Young men, often conscripts, following orders in a war they didn't start, dying in ways that no one should die. There's no glory in any of this. There's survival. There's duty. There's the grinding horror of industrial warfare reduced to its most personal, most brutal form. The M2 flamethrower, in the end, is a weapon that works because war is hell, and sometimes hell requires tools designed specifically for its condition. It doesn't make the men who used it monsters. It doesn't make the enemy subhuman. It makes explicit what all warfare does implicitly. Reduces human beings to problems that must be solved, threats that must be neutralized, obstacles that must be removed. The only honest way to talk about weapons like the M2 is to acknowledge that they exist because we as a species still choose war as a means of resolving conflicts. The flamethrower isn't an aberration. It's war distilled to its purest form. Fire-consuming flesh, the oldest weapon wrapped in 20th century technology, deployed in the service of nations that considered themselves civilized. The men who carried those weapons into combat on Pacific Islands knew this, even if they couldn't articulate it at the time. They knew they were doing something terrible, even if it was necessary. They knew they'd carry it for the rest of their lives, and they did it anyway. Because the alternative, letting their brothers die in frontal assaults that couldn't succeed, was worse. That's not heroism. That's just the mathematics of hell, calculated in blood and fire on volcanic sand in a war that killed millions and scarred everyone it touched. We remember them not because they wielded fire, but because they bore the burden of doing so and somehow found the strength to live with what they'd done.